For 500 years, the Amazon rainforest kept a secret. Explorers who sailed down its rivers in the 1500s described cities stretching for miles along the banks, packed houses, wide roads, plazas full of people. For centuries, historians dismissed those accounts as exaggeration, even fantasy. The Amazon, everyone assumed, was too hostile, too infertile, too wild to have ever supported large, organized societies. The true story of the rainforest, we were told, was one of small, nomadic tribes wandering beneath an untouched, ancient wilderness. That story is now falling apart. And it's not falling apart because of a lucky shovel strike or a chance discovery by a hiker. It's falling apart because of two technologies working together. A laser that can see through solid forest canopy and an artificial intelligence that knows how to read what that laser sees. In the last few years, this combination, LiDAR and machine learning, has uncovered lost cities, road networks, farms, and monuments across an area of rainforest larger than most European countries. And we are, almost certainly, only at the beginning. This is the story of how AI is rewriting the history of the Amazon, and how much more of the past might still be waiting under that canopy. To understand why this discovery matters, you first need to understand why it took so long. The Amazon basin covers roughly 6 million square kilometers, an area larger than the European Union. Beneath its canopy, ancient stone doesn't exist the way it does in Egypt or Greece. Amazonian builders worked mostly with earth, wood, and packed clay, materials that decay quickly and get swallowed by root systems and rapid plant growth. Within decades of a settlement being abandoned, the jungle can erase almost all trace of it from the surface. On top of that, walking through the rainforest to survey it the old-fashioned way, on foot, cutting paths with a machete, is brutally slow. A single research team might spend an entire field season mapping just a few square kilometers. At that pace, fully surveying the Amazon on foot would take many human lifetimes. So archaeologists faced a genuine paradox. Colonial-era writers described dense, organized populations along the rivers. Soil scientists found signs of large-scale agriculture, but visible ruins were scarce, and traditional survey methods couldn't cover enough ground to settle the question one way or the other. That's where LiDAR enters the picture. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. The concept is similar to radar, except instead of radio waves, it uses pulses of laser light. Here's how it works in practice. A sensor, mounted on an aircraft, a helicopter, or increasingly a drone, fires hundreds of thousands of laser pulses toward the ground every second. Most of those pulses hit the top of the forest canopy and bounce straight back. But not all of them. Some slip through small gaps in the leaves, bounce off branches partway down, and a fraction of them make it all the way to the forest floor before reflecting back up to the sensor. By timing exactly how long each pulse takes to return, the system can calculate the distance to whatever it hit. Do this hundreds of millions of times over a single flight, and you get an enormous cloud of data points, a point cloud, representing every surface the laser touched, from the top of the canopy down to the dirt. Then comes the part that makes this technology so powerful for archaeology. Software can filter out all the points that bounced off leaves and branches, keeping only the ones that reach the actual ground. What's left is essentially a digital deforestation, a bare earth model of the terrain, as if every tree had been erased, revealing whatever shapes are hiding underneath. If people built raised platforms, dug canals, cut roads, or piled up mounds centuries ago, those shapes are often still there as subtle bumps and depressions in the ground, invisible to someone standing in the forest, but clearly visible once the vegetation is digitally stripped away. This isn't brand new technology. Airborne LiDAR has existed in some form for decades, but it has become dramatically cheaper, lighter, and higher resolution in just the last several years, which is exactly why the pace of discovery has accelerated so quickly. The clearest example of what this technology can do comes from the Upano Valley in the Ecuadorian Amazon at the foot of the Andes. Archaeologist Stephen Rostein had been excavating in the region for decades, aware that earthen mounds existed in the area, but with no way to grasp their true scale. That changed after an airborne LiDAR survey, funded by Ecuador's National Institute for Cultural Heritage, flew over the valley and captured the terrain hidden beneath the forest. What emerged from that data stunned the research team. Rather than isolated mounds, the scans revealed a densely interconnected urban landscape. 5 large settlements and 10 smaller ones spread across roughly 300 square kilometers, each packed with residential platforms and ceremonial structures. In total, researchers identified more than 6,000 rectangular earthen platforms, plazas, and mounds, all linked together by a network of wide, straight roads cut at deliberate right angles. This wasn't a scatter of separate villages. It was a planned, interconnected urban system. Cities linked by engineered roads, surrounded by agricultural terraces and water management infrastructure, including canals and causeways. Researchers on the project described the experience of reviewing each new layer of data as feeling like opening a gift every single day. The dating is what makes this find especially remarkable. These settlements were built more than 2,500 years ago, making them over 1,000 years older than any other known complex society in the Amazon. In other words, organized urban life in the Amazon didn't begin during some later, more advanced period. It was happening while ancient Greece was still building its first democracies. The scale of landscape engineering involved drew immediate comparisons to the garden cities of the classic Maya. Researchers cautioned against pushing that comparison too far. The Upano settlements weren't necessarily as extensive or complex as later Mesoamerican civilizations, but the fact that a network this sophisticated could exist, invisible for two millennia, was itself the headline. Ecuador isn't the only place where this story is playing out. Head south into the Bolivian Amazon, into a region called Llanos de Mojos, and researchers using the same airborne laser technology uncovered something just as striking. From a helicopter hovering roughly 200 meters above the canopy, scientists digitally deforested 6 different survey areas, ranging in size from a few square miles to over 30. What they found was the heartland of the Casarabe culture, a society that flourished roughly between the years 500 and 1400. The LiDAR data revealed monumental platform and pyramid architecture at the center of urban settlements, with raised causeways connecting a web of suburban-like communities stretching for miles. Perhaps most impressive was the water infrastructure, a massive system of reservoirs and canals engineered to manage seasonal flooding across the savanna. One researcher who studied the site noted that while none of the individual elements seemed exotic on their own, since complex settlement patterns like this exist across human history, seeing them expressed at this scale specifically in Amazonia for the first time was the real surprise. Sites like this matter because they reinforce a pattern rather than representing a single isolated fluke. The Upano Valley and Llanos de Mojos are separated by enormous distances and by many centuries, yet both reveal the same underlying truth. Pre-Columbian Amazonian societies were repeatedly capable of large-scale urban planning, monumental construction, and sophisticated environmental engineering. To understand how these ancient societies fed large populations, we have to talk about dirt. Specifically, a kind of dirt that shouldn't naturally exist in the Amazon at all. Most rainforest soil is thin and nutrient-poor. Constant heavy rain washes minerals out of the ground faster than the ecosystem can replace them, which is part of why scientists long assumed the Amazon could never support dense agricultural populations. But across large portions of the basin, researchers keep finding patches of soil that are dark, rich, and remarkably fertile. A substance now known as terra preta, or dark earth. This soil wasn't a natural accident. It was engineered over generations by indigenous communities who enriched the ground with charcoal, organic waste, pottery fragments, and composted material. The result was a soil capable of supporting intensive farming in an environment where farming should have been nearly impossible. Estimates suggest this engineered soil now covers an area of roughly 154,000 square kilometers, nearly twice the size of Ireland. This detail matters for our story because it flips the old assumption on its head. The Amazon's poor natural soil wasn't a barrier that kept large civilizations from forming. It was an obstacle that ancient Amazonians deliberately engineered their way around at a truly continental scale, centuries before anyone in Europe knew the region existed. So far, everything we've described is what LiDAR alone can do. But raw LiDAR data, on its own, doesn't hand archaeologists a neat map with labeled ruins. It hands them an overwhelming ocean of data points, often hundreds of millions per survey, mixed with natural bumps, fallen logs, animal burrows, erosion channels, and termite mounds that can look deceptively similar to human-made platforms. Sorting through that ocean by eye is exhausting and slow, and it's exactly the kind of pattern recognition task where modern machine learning shines. Here's roughly how the process works. Once a LiDAR survey filters out the vegetation and produces a bare earth terrain model, researchers apply visualization techniques, things like hillshade rendering or a relief visualization toolbox, that exaggerate subtle elevation changes, making faint, man-made shapes easier to see against the natural terrain. From there, machine learning models are trained to recognize the difference between natural landforms and human construction. Some projects use a method called random forest classification, where an algorithm is fed labeled examples of both natural and artificial features and learns statistical rules for telling them apart, analyzing shape, elevation, slope angle, and surrounding context. Other projects rely on deep learning architectures like convolutional neural networks and object detection frameworks such as faster RCNN, which scan across an image the way a human eye might, learning to recognize edges, geometric regularities, and repeating patterns that suggest deliberate construction rather than random natural erosion. What makes this approach so valuable is the sheer contrast between organic and artificial shapes. Nature rarely produces perfectly straight lines, precise right angles, or evenly spaced repeating structures. A river meanders, a hillside erodes unevenly, but a road connecting two settlements tends to run straight. A grid of agricultural platforms tends to repeat in regular, evenly spaced units. A defensive wall tends to follow a consistent, deliberate path. These are exactly the kinds of geometric regularities a trained model can learn to flag automatically, even inside enormous, noisy data sets. A wider review of 45 recent studies on this exact intersection of AI and airborne LiDAR for archaeology found that convolutional neural networks have become the leading technique for this kind of automated detection, consistently outperforming manual visual inspection in both speed and consistency once properly trained. Similar approaches have already been used far beyond the Amazon, identifying tens of thousands of ancient burial mounds across Iberia, mapping historic stone walls, and locating buried charcoal production sites in European forests. One of the trickiest parts of teaching a machine to do this well is the training data itself. Unlike, say, teaching an AI to recognize cats or stop signs, there's no giant public library of labeled ancient platform images sitting around online. Researchers often have to build their own training sets from scratch, manually marking confirmed archaeological features on existing scans so the model has real examples to learn from. To get around this bottleneck, some teams borrow a technique called transfer learning, where a neural network already trained on a large general dataset gets fine-tuned on a much smaller set of archaeological examples, effectively giving it a head start instead of learning everything from zero. Other research groups have taken a slightly different, more accessible route, using open-source tools that let archaeologists without a heavy programming background train a random forest classifier directly on their point cloud data. That approach has proven especially useful for smaller teams and university labs that don't have access to the computing power or the machine learning expertise that a convolutional neural network pipeline typically requires. In both cases, the underlying goal is identical. Turn a mountain of raw laser measurements into a short, prioritized list of coordinates worth a closer look. Applied to a landscape as vast as the Amazon, this changes everything about the pace of discovery. Instead of a research team spending years manually scanning terrain models square kilometer by square kilometer, a trained model can process the same data in a fraction of the time, flagging thousands of candidate sites for human experts to review, verify, and prioritize for ground investigation. It's tempting to imagine AI as some kind of magic autopilot that finds lost cities on its own. That's not really how it works, and it's worth being honest about the limits here. Machine learning models are only as good as the data they're trained on, and archaeological features are notoriously varied. A platform in Ecuador doesn't necessarily look like a platform in Bolivia, and both can be confused with natural terrain features if the model hasn't seen enough labeled examples. False positives are common. A termite mound, an old riverbed, a fallen tree root system, all of these can superficially resemble human construction to an algorithm that hasn't been carefully tuned. This is why every major discovery discussed so far still depends heavily on human archaeologists. AI narrows an impossibly large search space down to a manageable list of promising locations. Researchers then follow up with additional methods, including ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and radiocarbon dating, to confirm what's actually there, understand how old it is, and figure out who built it. One archaeologist involved in these surveys has emphasized a simple rule for younger researchers. Your first gut impression of what you're looking at is often wrong, and only careful, methodical evidence gathering can confirm a real discovery. In other words, LiDAR finds the shapes. AI helps sort the signal from the noise across an enormous amount of data, but it still takes trained archaeologists digging real trenches and running real lab tests to turn a promising anomaly into a confirmed piece of history. Here's the number that should really put this story in perspective. Less than 1% of the Amazon basin has ever been systematically surveyed by archaeologists. That means an area roughly twice the size of India remains essentially unexamined for signs of ancient human settlement. Based on statistical modeling of settlement patterns already confirmed, some researchers estimate that anywhere from 10,000 to as many as 24,000 additional earthworks could still be hidden beneath the Amazon's canopy, simply waiting for a LiDAR flight and the right detection algorithm to reveal them. And there's a strange, painful irony connected to how some of this hidden landscape becomes visible at all. In recent years, the Amazon has experienced historic droughts, with river levels dropping and tree cover thinning under extreme stress. Climate change, which threatens to destroy vast portions of this ecosystem, has in some cases also exposed ancient structures that had been buried in vegetation for centuries. It's a bittersweet kind of revelation. The same environmental crisis endangering the rainforest's future is, in isolated cases, uncovering pieces of its past. This has led some archaeologists and remote sensing advocates to push for a much larger project, systematically scanning as much of the Amazon and other endangered landscapes worldwide with airborne LiDAR before the window closes. The argument is straightforward and urgent. Deforestation, agricultural expansion, and infrastructure development are erasing potential archaeological sites. At the same time, the rainforest itself is under threat, and every year of delay likely means permanent, irreversible loss of information about human history. Let's step back and look at what all of this actually means for how we understand human history. For most of the 20th century, the dominant academic view treated the Amazon as a green desert, a place too poor in resources to ever support anything beyond small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers. Large, complex civilizations were assumed to belong to drier, more manageable environments. The Andes, Mesoamerica, the river valleys of the Old World. The combination of LiDAR and AI-assisted analysis has demolished that assumption piece by piece across multiple independent sites, the Upano Valley in Ecuador, Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia, and the Upper Xingu region of Brazil, where decades of ground survey had already revealed extensive low-density garden cities linked by wide roads and defensive ditches. The pattern keeps repeating. Planned settlements, engineered roads, managed agriculture, sophisticated water control, populations large enough to require genuine urban organization. Historical accounts from early European expeditions down the Amazon River, once dismissed by scholars as exaggeration or fantasy, are increasingly being read in a new light. Descriptions of dense riverside settlements, organized streets, large communal buildings, and populations comparable to European cities of the time no longer sound like the invention of an over-enthusiastic chronicler. They sound like an eyewitness account of a civilization that was very much still alive right before European introduced disease devastated it within a single generation. That's perhaps the most sobering part of this whole story. Some estimates suggest as many as 5 million people may have lived across the Amazon basin around the year 1500. Within decades of European contact, smallpox and other diseases wiped out the vast majority of that population, collapsing societies so completely that the rainforest reclaimed their cities within a few generations, hiding them so effectively that it took 500 years and a laser mounted on an aircraft to find them again. There's also a broader lesson here about how quickly scientific consensus can shift once the right tool becomes available. For most of the 20th century, doubting the existence of large Amazonian civilizations wasn't a fringe position. It was closer to the mainstream academic view, backed by seemingly reasonable ecological arguments about poor soil and limited resources. It took decades of painstaking ground excavation, followed by this recent wave of airborne laser surveys and machine learning-assisted analysis, to finally overturn that consensus with hard, reproducible evidence. It's a useful reminder that never having found evidence of something is not the same statement as it never having existed. Sometimes it simply means nobody had yet found the right way to look. So where does this technology go from here? Costs for LiDAR sensors keep falling, and the hardware keeps getting smaller and lighter, meaning drones can now carry out surveys that once required a full aircraft and a much bigger budget. That opens the door for smaller research teams, universities, and even local communities to conduct their own surveys of areas that might never have been prioritized by major international expeditions. On the AI side, models keep improving as more labeled training data becomes available. Every new confirmed archaeological site adds to a growing library of verified examples, which in turn makes future detection models faster and more accurate at telling real structures apart from natural terrain quirks. Some researchers are even exploring combining LiDAR with other remote sensing sources, like multispectral satellite imagery, to cross-check candidate sites before committing to expensive ground surveys. The long-term vision some archaeologists are pushing for is genuinely ambitious. Systematic, wall-to-wall LiDAR coverage of the entire Amazon basin, paired with AI models running continuously across that data, flagging new candidate sites faster than any human team ever could. If that vision becomes reality, we may be standing at the very beginning of a golden age of Amazonian archaeology, one where the region goes from being the least understood inhabited landscape on Earth to one of the most thoroughly documented. 500 years ago, a group of European explorers floated down a river and described cities they didn't understand and ultimately chose not to believe. For centuries afterward, the rainforest itself finished the job of erasing the evidence, swallowing streets, plazas, and monuments beneath root systems and rapid green growth. Today, a laser beam and a trained neural network are doing what centuries of assumption couldn't, reading the ground truth. Not a return to the myth of El Dorado, but something arguably more remarkable, solid evidence that the Amazon was never empty, never simple, and never just a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was, in places, a landscape of cities, roads, farms, and engineered rivers, built by societies whose full story is only now starting to come back into focus. And with less than 1% of the basin properly surveyed, the real question isn't whether more lost cities are still out there. It's how many and how soon the algorithms will find them.